Of the Weber State Weekly Football Show. We are a member of the Big Sky Podcast Network, and I'm your host, flying solo tonight, talking football, Colby Peterson. Let's talk a little bit about what's coming up on today's show. So obviously we're going to recap the first round playoff matchup with the North Dakota Fighting Hawks in Ogden last weekend, talk a little bit about how that game went, and some news that broke today about how that game came to be in Ogden, and some eyebrows raised about the bidding process for first round playoff games. So we'll dig into that a little bit, kind of talk about what that means, plus talk about how the game went and what it might mean for next week against a familiar foe, number 4 Montana State, back in Bozeman for the Wildcats, taking the trip up there. So we'll talk all about that. We'll also take a look at the broader FCS playoff bracket. And so now that the first round is done, the seeded teams will get their opportunity to play some of the winners of this last week. And so we'll talk through some of that. We'll, of course, talk about the implications for the Big Sky Conference, the way that things went this week, and what it would mean for next week. But then also just some games to watch across the country now that the bracket has thinned a bit and the seeded teams get their opportunity to play. There's some really big and important games, I think, across the bracket. And so we'll point out some of those and give you folks an idea of what to watch for, because my understanding is all of these games will be on ESPN Plus this week. So plenty to watch, lots and lots of watch this weekend. But gonna give you a little bit of a rundown on which ones to pay attention to most. But before we get into all that, want to encourage everybody, please subscribe to the show, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, all good places to find Weber State Weekly. We appreciate those that have told their friends, posted about us on social media, all that kind of stuff. Thank you so much for letting other Wildcat fans know that Weber State Weekly exists and that we're trying to do our best to cover Wildcat sports and give Wildcat fans a little something to think about, something to chew on as we wait for the next game, the next match, whatever it might be. We're also on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Great places to chat with us and interact. Been doing our best to try and keep up right now because we've got hoops going on. We've got men's and women's basketball, which we'll do our best to get our men's and women's basketball podcasts going soon. Obviously, have a lot going on right now with volleyball and football, but we'll do our best to get those going soon. But you can always chat with us on social media about those things. I'll try and do our best to retweet, load up our Instagram story with things to watch out for, that you should know about. So good things there. Of course, then Twitter, lots and lots of breaking news, like the news that I just mentioned previously. Also, some other big news today that Idaho State's Charlie Regal leaving Pocatello to take an assistant job, or I think it was a positions coach down at Arizona State. And so all that stuff happens on Twitter. So good place to interact with us there as well. We also have a Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Weber State Weekly. Really want to thank our patrons always for their willingness to support us here at Weber State Weekly, and just donate your money to help us keep the lights on and give us the opportunity to continue to do this and support coverage of Wildcat sports. So thank you to our patrons so much. We really appreciate you guys. Honestly, couldn't do it without you. And if we did, it would get very expensive. So thank you so much. So now let's talk a little bit about last week. So like we said at the top, the Wildcats took to host the first round of the FCS playoffs for the first time since 2017. If you folks remember, back in 2017, the Wildcats faced Western Illinois that year. The Leathernecks came to Ogden. It was the first time that the Wildcats had hosted a first round home playoff game. I think it was the first home playoff game in school history at the time. And so obviously there have been a number of those since, but this was the first time the Wildcats had played in the first round since 2017, having been a seeded team in 2018, 2019. The spring season was weird because the bracket was smaller, and then, of course, missing the playoffs last year. So back in the first round again, Wildcats were, I think folks had them at number 9, so just outside of those seeded teams. And so the Wildcats did get the opportunity to host North Dakota. So the familiar foe from the Big Sky Conference now has moved on to the Missouri Valley Football Conference and the Summit League, but came to Ogden, had not played the Fighting Hawks since 2019. If you folks remember that game, it was a game where Wildcats were actually playing behind. Hawks came in ranked. I believe they were ranked 18 or 19, something like that, coming into that game. The Wildcats were highly ranked in that one, and it looked like they might lose, but then the Hawks gave them an opportunity with a late fumble, giving the Wildcats an opportunity to score a touchdown and go ahead and win the game. So another ranked win for the Wildcats in 2019. And the last time that Weber State had seen the Fighting Hawks since. So Fighting Hawks come to town. They come to Ogden on Saturday to face Weber State. They were coming in number 20. They were the 20th team in the field, coming to see Weber State at number 9. And well, I won't talk about that yet. We'll talk about that later because I want to talk a little bit about the bidding, but I'll say that for the end of the segment. But for now, we'll talk a little bit about what we sort of proposed during the football game day show. If you listen to it, we had former Weber State quarterback Jadrian Clark, along with the Signpost's own Emily Miller and former Weber State coach Tom Stackeruk there, talking a little bit about what might be successful against the Fighting Hawks for the Wildcats. One of those things that we mentioned in that show was that North Dakota State had put up quite a number of yards on North Dakota on the ground. I think it was around 350 yards or something like that. Quite a few yards on the ground against them. We said that that's a strength that the Wildcats have. We know that there's a deep stable of running backs and they've run the ball very effectively, even against tough competition this year. Wildcats, if you remember, taking on the number 1 rush defense in the conference when Montana came to Ogden, ran all over them in that game. So we knew that running the ball well was going to be a key against North Dakota, and that's exactly what happened, folks. 350 yards on the ground, 2 100-plus yard games for Josh Davis and Damon Bankston, plus a good performance by, not just those two, but of course, Dante McMillan had a good game, ended up with 66 yards and a touchdown, or 64 net and a touchdown. Just a really solid day of running the ball overall. And so it worked. 350 yards total, 330 yards net on the ground that day on 59 attempts, 4 touchdowns. Really, really productive day on the ground. And I think that was really the difference. Gave the Wildcat offense the spark that it needed, because through the air, because there were so many attempts on the ground, there wasn't a lot of throwing the ball very much. So Bronson Barron just 5 of 11 with 110 yards and a touchdown. Of those 110 yards, 46 came on a long pass to John Christensen. So throwing the ball, not necessarily the thing that was prioritized, because we knew, like we said, going into the game day show last week, that running the ball was something that the Hawks didn't necessarily defend terribly well. And so just like the matchup against Eastern Washington earlier this year, they took advantage of that matchup, going for 330 yards net, 4 touchdowns, just something that the North Dakota Fighting Hawks could not deal with in a similar way that Eastern Washington couldn't earlier in the season. So liked to see that. And it also felt like Josh Davis had his moments, of course, where it seemed like maybe his ankle's still not 100%. He's always had ankle problems, it seems, ever since his freshman season. After that, just continually plagued by that injury. But he did have some really big moments. He had some big runs. I mean, his long was 30 yards, but he was averaging 6.1 yards a carry. Now, only lost a single yard the entire game. And so on 21 attempts, pretty good average. And I think hopefully a sign that bodes well for the Wildcat running back stable, because I think that they've been a little bit banged up. If you remember, Damon Bankston missed a game a few weeks ago now, but still that was after the bye week. And so just giving him the opportunity to get healthy, he looked really healthy in this one. It looked like he was pretty much close back to his original self, went for 122 yards, 1 touchdown on 15 carries. So he was averaging 8.1 yards a carry, quite a bit, on a long of 39. So that was his longest run, just grinding it out. And of course, the thing with Damon Bankston is once he gets past that second level, if he can get through the second level, the defense is in huge trouble, because he can accelerate so quickly. And he had a number of really good runs in the middle of the field. And so they really had a hard time once he was loose to kind of go and get him and bring him down. And so makes sense that he would have a 122-yard day. Just incredible day for Damon Bankston. But of course, and then Dante McMillan, I think the workhorse of this Weber State running back stable, 12 carries on 64 yards net, averaged 5.3 yards a carry. Just did a great job. Always good to see DMAC. It was good to see him get that touchdown too, because I think a lot of folks look at the Weber State run game, and because it gets split out among Josh Davis and Damon Bankston and Dante McMillan and Chris Jackson, who we didn't see on Saturday, might still be working through some injury. It looked like he was struggling in that Idaho State game. Also struggled again, it seemed, in the Northern Arizona game. So might have been rehabbing an injury, just giving him a chance to get healthy ahead of what will now be a game against Montana State this weekend. Didn't need to see him, and so we didn't. But those four guys, the carries get spread around them quite a bit, and so you won't see a Weber State running back that's just going to necessarily jump off the page with yards or anything like that. It's not the way that it works at Weber State, because they have so many good talents that they just spread the touches around, and it works really, really well. Keeps legs fresh, and I think that we're seeing the fruits of that because they have spread the ball around and the attempts so much across the season. Guys aren't so banged up as, say, maybe a guy who really takes like 70-80% of the load a lot of time. The Wildcats' legs have been relatively fresh, and so they have those opportunities like we talked about with Damon Bankston, where if he gets loose, he's got the speed to just break it off and really hurt the defense. Really great to see that paying dividends now that we are very late in the season and it is postseason, playing in the FCS playoffs. Good to see that paying dividends. Another thing I wanted to talk about was that on the flip side of the ball, the Fighting Hawks rushed for 204 yards themselves. But I wanted to point out that there were some caveats. So 204 yards net on the ground. We talked about Tyler Hoosman, who was going to be somebody to watch for, and he was, right? 14 carries, 138 yards net. But a thing that I wanted to point out was that there were two really main plays that made the difference for the Fighting Hawks run game. The first one was, of course, the if you folks haven't seen it, if you weren't watching the game for whatever reason, there was this, what I think was an incomplete pass. I mean, you can go and watch the play. There was quite a bit of controversy across the FCS about this play, but the refs disagreed. They did not blow the whistle when the ball went forward, and so it lands in front of the offensive line. A heads-up play by North Dakota's Isaiah Smith. He picks the ball up, runs at 64 yards down the field, scores himself a touchdown. And so it's that was the first score for the Fighting Hawks in the game. The Wildcats were pitching, like Jeff Millard said, forward fumble was I guess the way that it worked, which, I mean, just mind-boggling. Folks, if you haven't seen the play, go look it up. It was on, it's on Twitter. I'm sure it's on Facebook somewhere, but it's just, everybody, I think, agreed that when you looked at that play, it was like, yeah, it's an incomplete pass. I mean, nobody hit the guy's arm. He just lost the ball. His arm went forward, and I think the ball kind of slips out of his hand. Ball goes forward, and it just falls. But the refs don't blow the whistle. So, like we said, Isaiah Smith picks the ball up, runs it back, and gets the touchdown, kind of breaks the seal for North Dakota. And everybody's kind of annoyed, I think. And it was pretty late in the second quarter when that happened. And so, the Wildcats, I think, were, getting ready to just say, okay, that was with 3 minutes and 52 seconds left, that 63-yard run. And so it's just a little bit frustrating, I think, for the Wildcat defense, because they didn't expect that. And the call goes to review, and mind-bogglingly, somehow they say the play is confirmed. And I think that's where maybe them calling it a touchdown on the field worked against the Wildcats, because if they had said, well, it's really difficult, because if they had said it was an incomplete pass, they wouldn't have reviewed it, because it wouldn't have been a scoring play. And I don't think that anybody on the North Dakota sideline would have disagreed with that being an incomplete pass, but they do the opposite. They say it was not. It was a forward fumble, I guess, and they score a touchdown on it. So Wildcats played a little bit. I thought they answered really well right after that. The next drive, Wildcats got the ball back, and they put together a really good drive, 10 plays, 75 yards, about 3.25. Well, 3.5 minutes, and a great play by Hayden Meacham to kind of put together this bobbled pass, and he scores the touchdown. The Wildcats are up 31-7 at that point with 27 seconds left in the half. So it looks really commanding for the Wildcats at that point, right? Like, hey, they're up 31-7. They respond from that bogus touchdown call. Lame, whatever. 27 seconds, but they get caught napping. and they get caught napping by the guy that we just mentioned previously, Tyler Hussman. Hussman breaks off a 72-yard run, and I think it sets up North Dakota for the opportunity to score a touchdown right at the end of the half to end in the second quarter 31-14, which looks a lot different than 31-7 when that 7 points should have been there in the first place. So I think a little bit frustrating for the Wildcats giving up that many yards. I mean, the total drive took just 16 seconds, 77 yards on 2 plays, because Hussman runs it for 72, gets tackled, another 5 yards to get into the end zone, and that's it. And they add another 7 points to their total. So the halftime 31-17. So yes, the Fighting Hawks did run for 204 yards net on the day, but 64 of those yards were that alleged fumble. Another 72 was the Hussman run to set the Hawks up for the touchdown. I mean, that was more just getting caught sleeping, I think, thinking that the Hawks were just going to kind of, grind it out. There's only 27 seconds left. There's nothing they can do. So, maybe they're just going to run some cliche plays, but Hussman made them pay. And so overall, I felt like the run defense was good, because if you take those 2 plays out, the Hawks didn't do very much on the ground, which is good to see, of course, because we know the opponent that is coming this weekend in Montana State and the way that they run the ball, which is just absolutely insane. And so kind of a bummer, go in at 31-14 and just hoping that the Wildcats answer in the second half. I guess I should wrap that up by saying Wildcats had a little bit of a struggle in the second half. They did score a touchdown late in the third quarter. Good drive, 58 yards, 8 plays. Josh Davis wraps it up with a 2-yard touchdown run. But after that, the offense really cooled off. They didn't score again after that. So the Wildcats were up 38 to 38-17 at that point, because the Fighting Hawks had gotten a field goal. So then I think, knowing that this is a playoff game and that this could potentially be the end of the season for the Fighting Hawks, they really kicked it into overdrive, and they fought, and they ended up making it close, a couple of touchdowns to get themselves back in the game. And the game at that point was 38-31 with 3 minutes and 4 seconds left. The Wildcats get the ball back. They don't do very much with it. They give it back to the Fighting Hawks. Fighting Hawks have one last chance to come back and tie the game, because they could try and go for 2 and win, but they probably wouldn't do that. They would probably just go and tie. And so it's all left on the defense at that point. Some really big plays. Winston Reed had a really good opportunity, almost had himself an interception, which would have ended the game, but then the next play, he shut it down. And so Wildcats win 38-31. If you're just looking at the box score, you look at this and say, well, Colby, this game was actually very, very close. And it was like, it was less close than you would think if you watched the game, as opposed to just looking at the box score. So question here from Jeff Millard in the chat on Facebook. By the way, Jeff and Mason, thanks so much for you guys hanging out in the chat with me. Talk a little bit about this game. Jeff asks, in the second half, did Weber let up, or did North Dakota make good adjustments? I think maybe it's a little bit of both, because part of it was, yes, we've talked about it this season about how the Wildcats have had their struggles in the third quarter. I was a little bit surprised that those struggles continued into the fourth, which is uncharacteristic. Normally, the Wildcats have done a good job of responding in the fourth quarter and adding points and making sure that they put themselves in a position to win for the most part. Or if they're behind, they found opportunities to score in the fourth quarter to get themselves back in the game and give themselves a chance to win in those 2 losses against Montana State and Sac State. But I also do think that North Dakota made good adjustments, right? Because I'll mention this in just a second, but it was not a great passing day because of the emphasis. And I think that because of that, the Wildcats didn't take advantage of opportunities necessarily when they had them to continue to move the chains and keep the pressure on the Fighting Hawks. Because I think, aside from the, we'll talk about it in just a second, but the Abraham Williams called back house call, another touchdown potentially for Abraham Williams, but they called it back on what I thought was a bogus penalty because the player that they said was fouled actually had fallen down, and so it was just like, how is that a penalty? So I mean, nothing unfamiliar to Wildcat fans who had watched Rashid Shaheed go through the same treatment for many, many years, including that dreaded San Diego State game where his house call would have won the game. But I think the Hawks did make some adjustments, and it made the run game less effective, but also just not a good passing day, which has me a little bit nervous going into the Montana State game. But also, there was a clear emphasis by Coach Mickey Mental on the run game, knowing that it was a weakness of the Fighting Hawks, having watched tape of the previous week against North Dakota State. So understandable, maybe a little too conservative in the fourth quarter. If they had just put a few more points on the board, they wouldn't have been in a position where they had to worry, where the defense had to stop them in crunch time. But overall, I think, like I said, a mix of both. Weber maybe did let up a little bit, but also North Dakota did make some adjustments. So back to the pass game, like I said, Bronson Barron ended up going 5 for 11 on Saturday with 110 yards. 46 of those, though, came on one play. There was a long pass to John Christensen, which was really big. Set up a touchdown later in the game. But I was thinking about this, and I was like, they did run the ball an awful lot. Was that just something that happens? We talked a little bit about this in the Montana State. If you remember us when we did the game day show, we talked a little bit about how Montana State was, I think, dead last at the time in passing offense in the conference, which if you were living in a vacuum and you didn't know what they were about, you'd look at that and go, oh, they must be terrible, right? But we know Tommy Mellott can throw the ball. It's just that they didn't have to because they were running the ball so much, especially their quarterbacks, Sean Chambers and Tommy Mellott. They were doing such a good job of running the ball, breaking contain, and punishing defenses in the middle of the field that they didn't need to throw the ball. And so I feel like maybe that's kind of what was happening on Saturday. The Wildcats, 5 for 11, that just, they didn't throw the ball a lot because they didn't have to, because they ran the ball for 330 yards net. They were getting things done on the ground. We did talk about the slow offense in the second half, and that's fine. But overall, it felt like, yeah, they didn't really throw the ball a lot because they didn't have to. And so I wouldn't say that I'm terribly worried about that going into this weekend, because we know that if you remember the last game in Bozeman earlier this season, the Wildcats faced Montana State up there, and Bronson had a really good game. He threw the ball really, really well. And that was a particular, I think, weakness of that Montana State team, that the secondary wasn't terribly strong. And so there were opportunities to exploit that. There were plenty of shots taken down the field. And we just talked about the problems with the conditions and catching the ball and stuff like that. But overall, I felt like, yeah, I mean, you're not going to throw the ball a bunch. And it felt like the shots that the Wildcats did take in this game, of those, 5 passes, those 6 passes that didn't land, a lot of them were pretty good shots down the field. There were a few to T-Mac that just didn't land. Credit to North Dakota. They had some decent PBUs, but they just didn't need to throw the ball a bunch because they were running it so well. If you're going to move the ball like that, why not? So I wouldn't say I was terribly nervous about going into this week's matchup with Montana State, because we've seen that they can throw the ball against defense like Montana State's. They did it before. I mean, especially that, if you folks remember that final drive in the fourth quarter, Bronson trying to drive and get down there and score the touchdown to win the game. They were very much in a position where they could do that. They just weren't able to execute when it mattered. And so, but overall, there were some really good throws in that game. So I want to talk a little bit now about that Abraham Williams house call, because like I said, he almost had himself his 5th of the season, which, if you think about that, keep this in mind, folks. He has 4 already this year. He is a sophomore. Rashid Shaheed's record, which Malik Flowers tied last weekend, by the way. Malik Flowers, another talented kick returner playing for the Montana Grizzlies. He tied Rashid's record last weekend against SEMO. He achieved the same mark of 7. But if you think about this, Abraham Williams has 4 in his sophomore season. He has 2 years of eligibility left. Now, I'm not going to say, he's going to keep that pace going. He's going to score 4 every year for the next 2 years, which would be just an absolutely insane number. That would crush the current record. But even if he only gets a couple in the next 2 years, he breaks the record, right? If he gets 2 next year and he gets 2 the following year, he effectively breaks the record. And so when Malik Flowers tied Rashid Shaheed for I think it was the NCAA record for kick returns for touchdown in a career with 7, I don't think Wildcat fans felt terribly. Obviously, they don't want a Montana Grizzlies guy. They don't want his name right next to one of the all-time great Wildcats in Rashid Shaheed. But at the same time, I think that maybe the sting was taken out of that a little bit because of the fact that Abraham Williams has been such a revelation this season. He's been so talented in the game that he, like I said, he could have had his 5th in this game. And who knows what happens in Bozeman next weekend. He had a kick return for a touchdown in that game last time that they took the trip up there. So is there a chance? Yeah, there could be because it happened before. So we'll see. But I think the sting of that of of Malik Flowers tying that record was maybe lessened because of how talented Abraham Williams just has been because he's been so good. But it was a little bit disappointing to see that touchdown come back because I think it really, I mean, essentially that touchdown would have put the game away for the Wildcats. They would have been up in a position where North Dakota just wouldn't have had the time to score enough points to catch up to the Wildcats if they had gotten that touchdown. So kind of a bummer, but overall, good things happening with the kick return game. And if teams continue to kick to Abraham Williams, which it feels like he's taking um his returns a little bit deeper now into the end zone. Not crazy deep, he's not like 5 yards deep into the end zone. He's not doing that. But he's maybe, a yard or two inside of the end zone. And if teams continue to put the ball right there for him, he has no problem taking the ball out and just having an opportunity. So yeah, it was a bummer that he didn't get that 5th house call for the season, which would have been the NCAA record for kick returns in a season, in a single season at 5. But wow, just the kid's so talented that I can't wait to see what he does. Who knows what will happen this weekend? Who knows what will happen next year or in the next 2 years? I think very well, though. He's on pace, definitely on pace to break that record and own it himself. So it'll be a Wildcat standing all alone eventually, I think, for the NCAA record for kickoffs return for a touchdown. Last thing, get into the game bidding, which was something that came out today. Wildcats were up 31-7, and like we said before, that 7 was really that forward fumble that Jeff Millard mentioned a little bit earlier. It shouldn't have been 7, in my opinion, in a lot of people's opinion. So, but the Wildcats had a pretty commanding lead at 31-7. But they allowed the Hawks to get back in with that Hoosman run for a touchdown right before the half, 16 seconds to go, what was it, 77 yards. Gave the Hawks a little bit of life, and they were able to climb back in it. Wildcats scored the touchdown in the third quarter, the 25-yard touchdown pass to Hayden Meacham. But after that, really played pretty conservatively. And I just wondered, it got me thinking if that was strategic or if it was more of something that they just wanted to burn the clock at that point because the lead was so commanding that they just wanted to chew up as much clock as they could. So they weren't going to throw the ball around the yard because that stops the clock if guys don't catch it, gives opportunities for them to get turnovers. So they just keep running the ball and don't be terribly worried about moving the chains, which it felt like that's what happened to me. That doesn't necessarily have me worried about coming into this game against Montana State this weekend because they're a different team with different weaknesses. So yes, they may have, the offense may have been a little bit conservative in the second half, but overall, I think that so long as they give the defense an opportunity to catch their breath throughout and make sure that guys don't get too tired, it shouldn't be an issue. So last thing I was going to mention was the fact that today, Jeff Millard here, talking a little bit about Bozeman. Without the safeties, Weber wins in Bozeman. So what will MSU do differently to try and win? The thing that I think they'll try in the Cat Grizz game a couple of weeks ago, they had a lot of looks on the offensive side of the ball with Chambers under center and Malott out in the wide receiver spot, and just doing kind of those dual looks, lots of little wrinkles like that, where we're going to now put 2 of the most dangerous rushers really slippery guys, out there and make you try and contain not just one, but two. So I think that that's something that they will try. They will try to run the ball. That's what they want to do. So it's really difficult because we saw what happened last time where it was all about contain, and their wide receivers did a really great job of blocking. We have to give them credit. They did a really good job of blocking some of the DBs downfield, which gave Malott an opportunity often to get a few more yards, sometimes 5-10 more yards because of that good blocking downfield. So I think that they're going to try more of those looks. We've also heard that Isaiah Fonse probably returns next weekend. And so if you folks remember the homecoming game last year when the Bobcats came to Ogden, Isaiah Fonse is very much, if you remember Cameron Scadabo from Sac State, Isaiah Fonse is very much in that vein of running back, very physical back. He's got a lot of strength. I remember there was a run last year at that homecoming game where he didn't go for like a whole bunch of yards, but I remember there was it might have been a linebacker or somebody going out of bounds with him, and he just like shoved the guy as he went out of bounds. He's so strong that he just pushed the guy right off of him. So if Isaiah Fonse returns, that's just one more weapon that they can use to force the Wildcats to try and stop that run game, because I really think that's going to be the name of the game. The Bobcats are going to run the ball. That's what they do. That's what they're really, really good at. Sean Chambers and Tommy Malott, obviously, I think Chambers is probably a better passer than Malott, but overall, we'll talk a little bit more about that on the game day show coming up later this week. But those are just a couple of things I differently to win, just because of the addition of guys, them getting guys back from injury. So, but the final thing I wanted to talk about, like I said, was the I wanted to talk about the bidding. So the rule is, in the first round, if you're a team that is not seeded, schools submit a bid to the NCAA, and this happens before the selection committee makes their decisions, right, about who should be where, who's the seeded team and who is not, right? And then so once that happens, then they open the envelopes and they say, okay, how much did these schools bid? And what we were told was that the schools that bid more were the ones that got the opportunity to host the first round in all of those playoff games. Well, it came out today through Freedom of Information Act and public records requests, that North Dakota actually outbid Weber State by quite a bit of money. They bid like $124,000 for that game, and Weber State only bid like $41,000. But the game was given to the Wildcats, so it sort of flies in the face of what the committee said they were about, which is that the higher bid gets the home game. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. So the Wildcats, like we said at the top, were the number 9 seed. Essentially, they were just outside of playing in the second round, getting a first round bye. But I think they absolutely deserved it. Everybody understood that, with their only 2 losses being teams that were respectively the 4th seed in Montana State and the 2 seed in Sac State, and both of those by a single possession. The Wildcats probably deserved a seed, but as they sort of ticked off and went down the line, there just wasn't room, and they ran out of runway, and so the Wildcats end up at 9. And so some people sort of equivocated in saying, well, they probably just gave the game to the Wildcats even though they bid less, because it would look really, really funky for a team like Weber State to go on the road in the first round and take on North Dakota in Grand Forks, when they were a team that was the 9 seed, a team that had absolutely demolished an FBS school in Utah State, who is now bowl eligible. Looks kind of weird for the number 9 to go to the 20th team. And so I think that that's probably one of the reasons why they did that. But it also has created a little bit of uproar, because now folks are talking about how, they're a little bit inconsistent with the way the committee decides how that happens. So I think it might spur some change, or at least some more transparency in the process next year, because a lot of questions are being asked right now about how they came to that decision. People, they slung accusations, when it was announced that Montana was in the field and that they would get a home game. Sure. I mean, you can argue that maybe Montana deserved to be in. I mean, when you get that far, I think Montana was the last team in. So it could have been Chattanooga. It could have been Montana. In this case, it was Montana. It's sort of like last year, Weber State was on the bubble. I think we were the first team out. And so FAMU, Florida A&M, they got in. The Wildcats did not get in. Florida A&M got Florida A&M got absolutely blown out in the first round. The Wildcats probably would have had a better showing, but that's just the way it worked out. The Wildcats didn't get in. They had just too many losses, so they didn't get in. And I feel like it's kind of the same situation with Montana, where they did get in. There were a number of factors that they could have chosen, and that maybe folks felt that the Big Sky was a stronger conference than the SoCon, which the SoCon had 4 legitimate schools that could easily have made the playoffs, like in Chattanooga, Furman, um, Samford, and gosh, how am I forgetting the fourth one? Anyway, they had some really good schools, and there was opportunity there, but not to be. So Chattanooga left Montana, who then ends up getting the playoff game, and they're saying, "Oh, they only let them in because of money." Well, apparently that wasn't, maybe yes or maybe no now, because of what we've seen on the other side. So let's move on really quickly and let's talk about the upcoming bracket for this weekend. I wanted to give Wildcat fans a little bit of an idea of well, I guess before I wrap that up, Wildcats obviously win in the first round. They hold on and beat North Dakota 38-31. And so they advance. Coach Jay Hill in his post-game interview on ESPN said survive and advance. And that was exactly what happened. Wildcats survive and they move on to the second round, taking a trip up to Bozeman this weekend to get round 2 against the Montana State Bobcats, who are conference champions. So let's talk a little bit about the upcoming bracket and what things might look like. So talk a little bit about what happened last weekend. In the Big Sky, let's stick there for a minute. Montana mounted a pretty big comeback against SEMO. If you folks remember, SEMO is the team that Weber State played in 2018. In the second round, SEMO had to come to Ogden. Wildcats played them that day. That was also the day that then Weber State played Brigham Young at the D. So you went to the SEMO game. If you were like me, you went to the SEMO game, then you went to the BYU game later, and Wildcats won both. And so, in my opinion, it's the greatest day to be a Wildcat. What a great day. So SEMO, I didn't love them. I was, this was a tough game because I don't love SEMO, but obviously, we've got our beef with the Grizz. And so early, it looked like SEMO was going to win. They were just dominating Montana. They were scoring points. But Montana came to life in the second half, and they scored like 20 plus or 30 plus unanswered on SEMO. So it ended up being like 34-24. Just a crazy roaring comeback by the Grizz in a stadium that Wagriz wasn't terribly full. I think a lot of, and again, Sam Herder from Hero Sports pointed out that attendance was down all across the country, because I think probably the holiday season, folks weren't home to go to the game. They were traveling, seeing family elsewhere. And so there weren't as many folks in town to go to some of those games. And so, yes, attendance was down overall, except for the Bayou Classic down in Louisiana. But so Montana comes roaring back, wins that game. And so now they'll get the chance to go to Fargo, and they'll get the chance to play North Dakota State again. If you remember, that's the team that they lost to in the playoffs last year. And so, I mean, a chance for them, but we'll have to see, because if the Grizz don't get their offense going early against North Dakota State, I don't think that they have that opportunity to come roaring back. So we'll see how they play in Fargo. Next, Idaho took the trip down to Hammond, Louisiana to face Southeastern Louisiana University. And man, what a shootout. They ended up losing, which was a huge bummer. But I also think that for Idaho fans, this was icing on the cake for them. Making the playoffs was just icing on the cake. Coach Jason Eck's first season in Moscow, just a stunning turnaround. They did a great job. They ended up losing that one by 3, 45-42. So like I said, an absolute shootout. Hope you took the over on that one, folks. But Southeastern Louisiana holds on to advance to face Samford. And so I was sort of wondering, like, okay, Coach Eck, he goes and he gets them into the first round of the playoffs. They play a close one down in Hammond, and they lose. What a bummer. Not exactly the way that you would want that to end, but also, like we said, house money, because nobody expected Idaho to get that far. Nobody expected them to make the playoffs. Nobody expected them to be as good as they were. So what does that mean for Coach Eck in year 2? I don't know. Did he raise the bar on himself? Do people expect the second round next year? I probably think so, but we'll just have to kind of see, because now he's going to go and do another full cycle of recruiting, get his own guys in there. But unfortunate to see the Vandals go out like that in just a really close game. Just a huge bummer. Jeff, I'll get to this in just a minute. Jeff Millard wants to know who are the upsets in the second round. I have a couple of previews that I'm going to talk about here in just a second, but I'll talk about them because I think that there's going to be some really, really key games. They're going to shape the bracket going forward. But let me wrap up just a couple more games here. Well, actually, those are the only two because, the Wildcats played, Montana played, and Idaho played in the first round. Now the two seeded teams, Montana State and Sac State, will have their opportunity to play. So let's talk about that Sac State game. They will face a good Richmond team that absolutely blew out Davidson 41-0. This is interesting because Sac has history working against them. Sac State has not done well in the playoffs. They've lost every year that they've played in the playoffs. So even though they were conference champions, winning a share of the conference title in 2019 with Weber State, winning, I think they won it outright in the spring, in the fall last year in 2021, and then a share of the conference title this year with Montana State. They haven't done well. They really haven't. They didn't play in the spring season, but 2019, they lost in the first round. In 2021, they had a first round bye, and they lost again, South Dakota State. And so they have history working against them here. And Richmond is an interesting team because they have gotten tougher as time has gone on. And so the thing I was thinking about here was like, okay, where might it be? Like, what might be the thing that would trip up Sac State? Because we know that they're going to run the ball. That's what they do. Their offense is, maybe somewhat similar to what Montana State is doing, where they like to put Asher O'Hara in. They like to run the quarterback. They will throw it a little bit, but for them, they're going to run the ball between Cameron Scadabo, who is now conference offensive player of the year, and Asher O'Hara, who is second, I believe, in the country now with rushing touchdowns. So, running the ball is the name of the game against them. And so how does Richmond deal with that? Well, looking at the national stats, because now that we're in, these big playoff scenarios, Richmond going through the list, trying to find where they rank nationally in terms of covering the run. Not looking good, folks. Not even on the first page here, the first 50. So it could really spell trouble for the Spiders because, yes, they beat a David's team out of the Pioneer, which is a non-scholarship league. It's not great, but looking through here, Richmond, where are you guys at? I think it's really kind of scary for them because if they can't stop the run, it is going to be a very long day. And so Sac State might get their win in this one. So Jeff Millard, is this going to be upset? I don't think so because, I'm just not seeing this. I'm not seeing this Richmond run defense, and I may have missed it because now I'm on the third page and I'm not finding it. But that will be the key. If they can somehow stop Cameron Scadabo and Asher O'Hara, they can give themselves a chance because they've played well. They put up 41, and so it's obvious that they can score the ball. But it's just a matter of how well they can. So Richmond, 23rd in the country in their rush defense. They give up 120 yards a game. So not terrible, not exactly, if we're being honest, that's actually above Weber State, I think. Trying to find the Wildcats here. Where do the Wildcats rank? And so, yeah, a decent run defense. So if they can deal with it, yeah, the Wildcats at 30. Sac State, they're 29th in their run defense. So stout run defense could be an opportunity. So maybe that's the key, though. That's what I think. If there's going to be an upset, it's going to be them shutting them down on the ground. Next up, some have rightly pointed out that Montana State play the Wildcats in the second round. It's maybe a little bit unfair to them because the Wildcats are tough. This is the highest unseeded team, and Montana State has to play them as the 4 seed. And so folks might look at that and go, well, how does that work? And the answer is regionalization. That's the reason why this matchup is happening, regionalization. So if you don't know, when they put together the FCS playoff bracket, where schools are plays an important role in who they will match up with in the first round and the second round, what have you, right? Because as time goes on and, geography will get larger and larger because there are fewer and fewer teams. So in this case, regionalization works against the Bobcats. They will have to play Weber State again in Bozeman which was a close game, if you remember last time. Wildcats with 4 safeties in that game, which cost them, those 8 points, cost them the game. They ended up losing by 5. So some folks, I think, are rightly complaining that this is a tough draw for Montana State, but I think it also speaks to the respect that Bobcat fans have for Weber State. They understand that the Wildcats are a tough team, and this is not an easy out, and they would prefer to get a different team, I think, altogether. They would have preferred someone else, but this is the way it shook out for them. So a little bit unfair to them. And I think that in addition to the transparency that we talked about previously with the first round bids, there's probably going to be a discussion around regionalization and its usefulness at this point, because a lot of folks on social media are calling for just seed teams 1 through 24 and let the bracket play out how it may, which I kind of agree with, because one of the things I really like about the FCS playoffs is that we have gotten the opportunity as Wildcat fans to play teams that we don't normally play, right? We've gotten a chance to play a SEMO and a Western Illinois and a Kennesaw State and a Maine, right? Which, I mean, I don't look fondly on that Maine game. You shouldn't either. It was not a great day. It was cold and we lost. But those are matchups that normally wouldn't happen, and they do happen in the playoffs. And so as a SCS football fan, I love seeing those kinds of things, whether, the Wildcats take the trip. The Wildcats have also taken the trip to Chattanooga to face the Mocs down there, and that happened because of the first round of the playoffs. So I think that getting rid of regionalization, while it's going to cost more, the NCAA pays for that travel. And so I think it could make for a better product overall, and probably more fair to the teams that actually did play well in the regular season, which right now Bobcat fans are feeling slighted because they feel that they played well, but they will have to take on a tough Weber State team in their home up at Bobcat Stadium. So we'll see how it plays out. Jeff Millard, back to your question, is this an upset? It could be, right? The Wildcats, they had a formula that was working. They just had a difficult time slowing down that run, and they gave away a lot of points. And had they not done that, the Wildcats might have pulled out a win in Bozeman. But I really think that Brent Vigen's got this like some weird voodoo magic over us, man. If you're a baseball fan, you might hear sometimes people talk about the Cardinals' devil magic because they just get so lucky. They just win somehow sometimes. And so I feel like maybe Brent Vigen's got that. He's got that devil magic. He's just so good at pulling out those close games in a way that maybe Jeff Choate wasn't previously. So could this be an upset? Yeah, I think so. And I think that Bobcat fans respect that it could be. Jay Hill has done really well in those rematch games. If you remember back in 2017, rematch game against the Birds, and the Wildcats smashed them. 2019 rematch game against Montana, and the Wildcats pull it out, beat Montana in the quarters, and head on to JMU. So, yeah. Could it happen? Yeah. And I think Bobcat fans realize that. Will it happen? I don't know, because now they have Malott and they have Chambers together, and they've got Isaiah Fonse back, and there are some new wrinkles to their offense that could be difficult for the Wildcat defense to deal with. Another one to watch for, Furman at Incarnate Word. I think everybody should be watching this one. Incarnate Word probably has the Walter Payton Award winner in Lindsey Scott. He's been really good. I think this is like his 4th school, but he's just been absolutely incredible. The Furman defense has been good, but I think that this right here is maybe, Jeff, why it won't be an upset, because their passing defense is 111th in the country. Lindsey Scott is the best passer in the country, maybe after Tim DeMoret, but overall, Scott is probably going to win the Walter Payton Award. Because he's just absolutely phenomenal. And the levels that he's playing, like if we talk about Eric Barrier last season and what he was doing, Lindsey Scott's numbers are beyond what Eric Barrier was doing last year, where Barrier won the Walter Payton Award. So I think that it's going to be a really tough day for Furman because their pass defense really struggles, and that is an absolute strong suit for Incarnate Word. And Incarnate Word has just absolutely clobbered teams this season. They've lost one game. They lost to SLU. Which was, I think, a dumb and annoying loss. I think it was SLU. They lost one game this season, and so they played really well. The teams that they've beat by a lot. So it could be a long day for the Paladins. They've had a good season, but strength versus weakness, I'm going to give it to Incarnate Word probably. So this one probably won't be an upset. One other, though, that might be an upset, Jeff, to answer your question for the last time, New Hampshire, Holy Cross. So New Hampshire taking the trip down to visit the Crusaders in Worcester, Massachusetts. Some people, including me, that Holy Cross didn't deserve a seed because they were coming out of the Patriot League. not a strong league, and they were a seeded team. Now, they had an argument, right? They beat a Buffalo team, I think, who is bowl eligible, or they will be bowl eligible. Well, they could be because one of their games got canceled because of Blizzard, and so I think they were going to try and reschedule it. But that's the Wildcats thing right now, that they absolutely clobbered a Utah State team that is now bowl eligible. So Holy Cross can say that, but their league is a little bit weak, and New Hampshire had a really good showing last weekend. I honestly didn't pick them to win, if you remember. I picked. Let me go back here and look at my picks here. I think I picked Fordham to win that game because it would have set up the rematch with Fordham and Holy Cross, and New Hampshire handled it really, really well. So could they beat Holy Cross? Yeah, they could. So if you're on upset watch, Jeff, that might be the one. So see, and Jeff, he agrees with me here. He's saying, I think New Hampshire wins this game. I think they do too. And so that then begs the question: if New Hampshire comes in and wins this game, what does that say about Holy Cross being a seeded team? Do they deserve it? Should the Wildcats have been seeded? Wildcat fans will say yes, but we'll see, because maybe we're wrong and the Crusaders win this game and prove to everybody that, in fact, they did belong. So that's kind of my preview for what's coming up, the FCS bracket. We'll talk a little bit more about the implications on Saturday's game day show. And so maybe we'll talk a little bit more about some of the matchups we didn't talk about, like Montana, North Dakota State. We'll talk about Delaware. Let me go back to the bracket really quickly, because Delaware winning last week, I think, was good for the CAA. I think they'll have to take on South Dakota State, which will be a tough game. South Dakota State plays very well in Brookings, and so that will be interesting. Samford has to take on Southeastern Louisiana now. Samford has been a really good team. We'll see how they deal with that high-flying offense. And then William and Mary takes on Gardner Webb. And Gardner Webb, I picked Eastern Kentucky to win that game, but Gardner Webb, their offense really showed out. They put up 52 points on them. William and Mary has a very stout defense, but we'll see. That's kind of my preview for all that. So look to the upcoming schedule, folks. Just one game, of course, and it's the game that we've already talked about. FCS playoffs in the second round, Saturday, December 3rd. Wildcats taking the trip to Bozeman once again this season to take on number 4 Montana State. That game will be at 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. It'll be on ESPN Plus, or you can listen to Steve Klauke on 103.1 The Wave. If you are so inclined, you can drive up there. I bet you it might be difficult to get tickets, because I know Cat fans are just absolutely hyped. They are absolutely hyped for this game, and so it's probably going to be a pretty packed house. So if you can, if you're interested, try and get your tickets. And if you don't, and you make the drive up there, I hope you find them, because it would be terrible to drive all the way up there and not get in the stadium. But it's going to be a good one, I think. A second round rematch. The Wildcats have done well in these games in the past, so we'll see how things shake out. But this is a really this is tough. This is a tough matchup for the Wildcats because of what we've already seen with their running quarterbacks on the ground. Jeff Millar with the last question here, asking about the turnover belt. So we did deliver the turnover belt to the team, to the equipment manager, maybe 2-3 weeks ago, something like that. We were able to get it to him. And in fact, you're reminding me now that I need to write that update in that GoFundMe and just update everybody. But we did deliver it. And so I don't know. We gave it to the team, and I don't know. It's in their hands. So maybe harass them when you see them and say, "Hey, what happened to the turnover belt? You guys want to put that on?" I don't know. But the belt is in their hands. So it did happen. I'll wrap up the show, guys. Email us, WeberStateWeekly@gmail.com, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can go to our patreon.com/WeberStateWeekly. Support us. Really appreciate those who do that. Like I said, really makes a difference for us, and gives us the opportunity to do what we do every single week. So thank you so much for being willing. And then the blog, WeberStateWeekly.com. I haven't written anything recently. I've been a little bit busy with a side project that I've been working on, plus trying to get ready for some of these new shows. But so we haven't written too much on the blog, but we're talking to some folks, and we might see a jump in that blog content in the spring semester, because we got some folks that are interested in maybe coming to write. So you might see a jump there, but as of right now, nothing new recently on the blog. I want to thank you all for hanging out with me, talking a little bit of football. I'll wrap it up like I always do. Weber State, Weber State,